The crack in the rock was 18 inches wide. Verity Thornton crawled into it when she was 18 years old, and nothing about her life was ever the same again. Everyone in Ridgecrest, Tennessee said she had lost her mind. The Reverend Josiah Blackwood prayed for her soul from the pulpit on 3 consecutive Sundays. Dr. Cornelius Marsh wrote in his medical ledger that she suffered from hysteria brought on by grief. Her eldest brother Marcus told anyone who would listen that his poor sister had always been fragile, always been strange, and that their father's death had simply pushed her over the edge into madness. But 40 feet inside that crack, in the absolute darkness beneath Sorrow Ridge, Verity stood in a room the size of a cathedral, and she understood something that none of them could see. Her father had not abandoned her. He had left her the most valuable thing he possessed. She just had to be brave enough to find it. This is a story about what lies hidden in tight places, about the treasures that reveal themselves only to those willing to turn sideways and push through, about a young woman who was given nothing and discovered everything, and about the quiet wisdom of fathers who trust their children with secrets too precious for words. It begins, as so many stories do, with a death and a will and a family torn apart by both. Jeremiah Thornton died on the 14th of October, 1851, in the farmhouse he had built with his own hands 40 years before. He was 63 years old, a man of few words and deep silences, and he left behind 4 children who had never quite understood him and a will that would divide them forever. The reading took place 3 days after the burial, in the front parlor of the farmhouse that smelled of wood smoke and grief. The lawyer was a thin man from Elizabethton named Horace Clement, and he read the document in a voice that betrayed no emotion, as though he were reciting a grocery list rather than dismantling a family. To Marcus, the eldest son, Jeremiah left the farmhouse in 200 acres of bottomland, the best soil in Carter County, black and rich and capable of producing corn that stood 8 feet tall by August. To Silas, the second son, he left the sawmill and the timber rights to the north slope, a fortune in oak and hickory waiting to be cut. To Phineas, the third son, he left the south pasture and the livestock, 60 head of cattle and a dozen horses that represented years of careful breeding. And to Verity, his only daughter, his youngest child, 18 years old and unmarried, Jeremiah Thornton left 40 acres on Sorrow Ridge, described in the will as that portion of rocky and unsuitable ground lying east of the creek and south of the old survey line, together with whatever may be found thereon. Whatever may be found thereon. The phrase hung in the air of the parlor like smoke. Marcus laughed first, a short bark of sound that contained no humor. Silas joined him a moment later. Even Phineas, who rarely spoke and never laughed, allowed himself a thin smile. Sorrow Ridge was a joke. Everyone in Carter County knew it. A narrow spine of exposed limestone running half a mile along the eastern edge of the Thornton property. Too steep to farm, too rocky to timber, too barren to graze. It had been in the family for 3 generations and had never produced a single dollar of value. The general assumption was that Jeremiah had included it in the will as a formality, or perhaps as one final dry joke at the expense of the daughter he had never quite known what to do with. Fitting, Marcus said, still laughing. The runt gets the bones. He was 34 years old, heavy and deliberate, a man who measured the world in acres and bushels. He had their father's build but none of his patience, and he had spent his entire adult life waiting to inherit the farm he now owned. She can eat rocks for supper, Silas added. He was 30, the cruelest of the brothers, with a talent for finding the words that would wound most deeply. Maybe she can build herself a nice little stone hut and live like a hermit. Verity said nothing. She sat in the corner of the parlor with her hands folded in her lap and her face carefully blank, the way she had learned to make it blank during 18 years of being overlooked and underestimated. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and she had learned long ago that showing emotion in this family was the same as showing weakness. Only Phineas did not laugh. He stood by the window with his arms crossed, looking out at the fields that were no longer his father's and not yet his brother's. His expression was impossible to read. He was 25, the quiet one, the one closest to Verity in temperament, if not in affection. When their mother had died 11 years ago, Phineas was the only one who had sat with Verity while she cried. He never spoke of it afterward. Neither did she. But she had not forgotten. The lawyer finished reading the will and began gathering his papers. Marcus was already talking about improvements to the farmhouse, expansions he had been planning for years. Silas was calculating timber yields in his head, his lips moving silently as he multiplied board feet by market prices. Phineas continued to stare out the window. Verity stood and walked out of the parlor without a word. No one tried to stop her. No one even noticed she was leaving. She had 1 week to vacate the farmhouse. Marcus had made that clear even before the lawyer arrived. This was his property now, and he had no intention of supporting a sister who could not support herself. She could find work as a seamstress in town, or as a domestic servant, or she could take her 40 acres of worthless rock and do whatever she pleased with them. Verity chose the rock. She spent the week packing what little she owned into a canvas sack: a bedroll, an axe, a knife, a coil of rope, a tin lantern, and a small supply of whale oil. $11 in coin, her entire savings from years of selling eggs and mending clothes for neighbors, and 3 books. The first was a geology text, borrowed so many times from the lending library in Elizabethton that the librarian had finally given it to her. The second was a bound volume of scientific journals that her mother had purchased years ago from a traveling bookseller. The third was her mother's Bible, which Verity kept not for devotional purposes, but because her mother's handwriting filled the margins. Small, careful notes in fading ink. And her mother's handwriting was the closest thing to her mother's voice that remained in the world. Constance Thornton had been a schoolteacher before her marriage, one of the few educated women in Carter County, and she had passed her love of learning to her youngest daughter the way other mothers passed down recipes or quilting patterns. In the evenings when the farm work was done and the men were occupied with their own concerns, Constance had taught Verity to read from those scientific journals. She had explained the principles of geology and natural history. She had shown her daughter how to look at the world with curious eyes, how to ask questions, how to find answers. She had died when Verity was 7, carried off by a fever that swept through the county that winter. 11 years later, Verity still remembered the last thing her mother had told her. They had been sitting together by the fire, Constance too weak to hold a book. Verity reading aloud from the geology text. "Fear is a door," her mother had whispered. "Walk through it." Verity had not understood at the time. She was beginning to understand now. On the morning of her departure, she found something tucked into the pages of her mother's Bible. A letter in her father's handwriting, addressed simply to Verity. She opened it with trembling hands. The letter was short. Her father had never been a man of many words. "Your mother found something on the ridge before she died. She never had the chance to explore it. I promised her I would leave it to the one who would look. You are the one who will look. Trust what she taught you. Trust what you see." That was all. No explanation, no instructions. Just a cryptic message from a dead man who had apparently been keeping secrets for 11 years. Verity read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back in the Bible, and walked out of the farmhouse for the last time. The walk to Sorrow Ridge took most of the morning. She crossed the creek on a fallen hickory log, climbed through a stand of tulip poplars whose leaves had turned the color of old gold, and emerged onto the rocky spine of the ridge as the sun reached its zenith. The view from the top was magnificent and utterly useless. She could see the creek valley below, the farmhouse where her brothers were already arguing about fences and field rotations, and beyond that, the blue haze of the Appalachian Mountains receding into distance. But the ridge itself was exactly what everyone said it was. Bare limestone, pale as bone, fractured and weathered, covered in patches of lichen and sparse clumps of cedar scrub. No soil, no water, no shelter, just rock. Verity spent the afternoon walking her property, all 40 acres of it. The task did not take long. Sorrow Ridge was narrow, perhaps 30 feet wide at its broadest point, and 40 acres of narrow ridge covered a lot of linear distance, but very little usable space. She noted what she saw with the careful attention her mother had taught her. Exposed limestone in horizontal beds, heavily fractured, occasional sinkholes where the rock had dissolved and collapsed. No springs, no flat ground, no timber worth cutting. Her brothers had been right about one thing. The land was, by any conventional measure, worthless. But Verity was not conventional. She was observant, and what she observed as she walked the ridge in the slanting afternoon light were the fractures, The limestone was full of them, vertical cracks running through the rock at irregular intervals, some hairline thin, others wide enough to insert a hand. Most were dry and empty, leading nowhere. But several of them did something peculiar. They breathed. Verity had read about this in her mother's geology text. The phenomenon was called cave breathing. It occurred when air moved in and out of underground passages in response to changes in barometric pressure and temperature differential. A breathing crack meant a void below. A void meant a cave, and a cave could mean anything. She found the largest crack on the eastern face of the ridge, about halfway along its length. It was a vertical fissure in a small bluff, 3 feet tall and roughly 18 inches wide. Just wide enough, she judged, for a person to enter sideways, if the person were not large. At 5'4", slim and narrow-shouldered, Verity possessed the kind of build her brothers had always mistaken for weakness. She knelt beside the crack and held her hand in front of it. Cold air moved outward against her palm, steady and persistent, with a force that surprised her. The temperature differential between the air inside the crack and the November air outside was significant. She estimated the exhalation at perhaps 55 degrees, warm compared to the surface air, which was in the low 40s. The smell was clean, wet stone, a faint mineral sharpness. No rot, no sulfur. Good air, moving air. Air that had been somewhere and was going somewhere else. Verity sat back on her heels and looked at the crack for a long time. Her mother had found something on this ridge. Her father had promised to leave it to the one who would look. And here was a crack in the rock that breathed like a living thing, exhaling secrets from somewhere deep below. The question was not what lay beyond the crack. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out. She made camp that night in the lee of a limestone outcrop that blocked the worst of the wind. She built a small fire from cedar deadfall, ate a handful of parched corn, and sat looking at the stars while the crack breathed its cold breath into the darkness 100 feet away. Fear is a door, her mother had said. Walk through it. In the morning, Verity lit her lantern. She removed her coat because 18 inches was 18 inches, and she needed every fraction. And she crawled into the crack. The first 10 feet were the worst. The limestone walls pressed against her chest and back simultaneously. Every breath required a conscious expansion of her ribs against the stone. The rock was rough, not sharp enough to cut, but abrasive, scraping her dress and the skin beneath it with every inch of forward movement. She could not move her arms freely. She could not turn her head. She could see only what the lantern illuminated directly ahead. More crack, more stone, a narrowing that made her heart accelerate before it widened again. Just barely, just enough. She moved by sliding her feet forward, then shifting her hips, then her shoulders, then her feet again. It was less like crawling and more like being swallowed, a slow, incremental consumption by stone. At 20 feet, the crack angled slightly downward. The floor dropped 6 inches, and her boots scraped on loose gravel that had accumulated over centuries. The walls were wet here, slick with condensation that was cool against her hands when she braced herself. The lantern flame flickered in the moving air but held. At 30 feet, the crack narrowed to what she judged was 14 inches. Verity stopped. Her ribs were compressed. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. For the first time, a spike of pure terror drove through the curiosity and the determination. A primal, animal fear of confinement, of being stuck, of dying in the dark between 2 walls of stone that did not care whether she lived or died. The fear was enormous. It filled the narrow space like water fills a vessel, leaving no room for anything else. She closed her eyes. She counted 10 breaths, each one a small war against the stone that pressed her chest. She thought of her mother's voice, faint and distant but still there, still whispering. Fear is a door. Verity walked through it. At 35 feet, the crack began to widen. The walls receded, first an inch, then 2, then suddenly a foot on each side. She could move her arms. She could turn her shoulders. She could breathe without fighting for it. The floor leveled and then dropped again, more steeply this time, a natural ramp descending into darkness. At 40 feet, the crack ended, and Verity Thornton raised her lantern and looked into a room the size of a cathedral. The chamber was immense. The lantern light, which had been sufficient to illuminate every detail of the crack, dissolved into the darkness like a single star against the night sky. She could see the floor beneath her feet, smooth limestone pale as milk, sloping gently downward. She could see the nearest wall, perhaps 20 feet to her left, rising vertically into blackness. But the far wall, the ceiling, the full dimensions of the space, these were beyond the lantern's reach. She stood at the edge of something vast, and the vastness pressed against her, not with the claustrophobic weight of the crack, but with its opposite, an openness so profound it was almost dizzying. She shouted, not a word, just a sound, a single syllable expelled from her chest. The echo came back to her 3 times, each iteration fainter and farther, arriving from directions she could not quite determine. The chamber had depth, it had height, it had distances that her lantern could not measure and her voice could only suggest. Verity walked forward. The floor was remarkably even, a natural pavement of water-smooth limestone, dry and solid. Her footsteps echoed with a quality she had never heard before, a resonance that was not sharp or metallic, but deep and sustained, as though the stone itself were vibrating in sympathy. After 30 paces, her lantern light reached something that made her stop and stare. It was not a wall. It was a formation, a massive curtain of flowstone, 30 feet high, cascading down from the unseen ceiling in frozen ripples of cream and amber and the palest rose. The flowstone was translucent at its thinnest edges, and the lantern light penetrated it, creating a warm glow that seemed to emanate from within the stone itself. Verity turned slowly, holding the lantern high. As her eyes adjusted and her light explored, the chamber revealed itself in fragments. Stalactites hung from above, their tips catching the light. Some slender as icicles, others thick and blunt as church pillars. The ceiling where the stalactites emerged was at least 40 feet overhead. Stalagmites rose from the floor in columns and cones of varying height, some barely knee-high, others taller than Verity herself. Where stalactites and stalagmites had met, over how many thousands of years she could not imagine. They had formed complete columns that ran from floor to ceiling, like the pillars of the cathedral the chamber resembled. Along the walls, the limestone had been sculpted by water into formations of staggering variety. Draperies of stone hung in folds as delicate as fabric. Rimstone dams, thin walls of calcite deposited at the edges of shallow pools, created terrace basins that held perfectly still water, clear as glass, reflecting the lantern light upward into the stalactites. The beauty of it was almost unbearable. Verity Thornton had never been given to strong emotion. 18 years in a family that valued stoicism had taught her to keep her feelings deep, the way the earth kept its heat. But standing in the center of that chamber, in the small circle of her lantern light, surrounded by formations that had been growing in darkness for tens of thousands of years, something broke open inside her. She sat down on a stalagmite that had been worn flat on top by some ancient flow of water. And for the first time since her father's funeral, she allowed herself to cry. But these were not tears of grief. They were tears of wonder, tears of gratitude, tears for a mother who had found this place and never had the chance to explore it, and for a father who had kept the secret for 11 years, waiting for the right moment, the right person, to reveal it, whatever may be found thereon. Her brothers had laughed at that phrase. They had assumed it was a joke, or a formality, or simply the ramblings of a dying man. They were wrong. Verity wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and opened the small notebook she had brought in her pocket. Her hands were still shaking, but her handwriting was steady. November 12th, 1851. Entered crack on east face of Sorrow Ridge. Passage approximately 40 feet, very narrow. Opens into chamber of extraordinary size. Estimate 80 feet wide, 100 feet long, ceiling 40 feet or more. Formations include stalactites, stalagmites, flowstone, rimstone dams. Temperature approximately 56 degrees. Air quality good. No bats observed. Floor dry and level. She paused, then added one more line. This is the most remarkable thing I have ever seen. Now I want you to stop for a moment. Close your eyes if you can. Imagine yourself in Verity's place, 18 years old, alone, standing in the darkness beneath a mountain with nothing but a small lantern and the echo of your own heartbeat. Surrounded by formations that have been growing since before humans walked this continent. Knowing that you are the first person to see this place in 10,000 years, perhaps ever. What would you do with a discovery like this? How would you even begin? Take a moment to think about it, and when you are ready, we will continue. Verity spent the next 3 days exploring. The cathedral chamber was only the beginning. From its far end behind the great flowstone curtain, a passage descended steeply for 60 feet and opened into a second chamber. Smaller than the first but equally striking, this room was dominated by a pool, a still, clear body of water perhaps 40 feet across and of unknown depth, fed by a slow drip from the ceiling that had been falling drop by drop for geological ages. Beyond the pool chamber, the cave continued. A low passage, hands and knees for 20 feet, led to a third room, long and narrow like a hallway, with walls covered in a dense growth of soda straw stalactites, hollow tubes of calcite thin as drinking straws, hanging from the ceiling in clusters so dense they looked like the inverted canopy of a crystalline forest. The soda straws were fragile. A breath could break them. And Verity moved through the room with a reverence that bordered on fear, terrified that her lantern flame, or her clumsy human body, would destroy something that had taken centuries to form. She mapped as she went, pacing distances, noting compass directions, sketching chamber shapes and passage connections in her notebook. The cave system proved to be extensive, at least a dozen chambers of various sizes, connected by passages that ranged from comfortable walking height to belly crawl squeezes. The total extent, she estimated, was perhaps a quarter mile. The temperature was remarkably consistent throughout, between 55 and 58 degrees in every chamber she measured, regardless of depth or distance from the entrance. This confirmed what she had read in her mother's books. Below a certain depth, the earth maintained a stable temperature, insulated from the seasonal extremes of the surface. The cave was a thermal constant, warm in winter, cool in summer, and as Verity explored deeper into the system, she began to understand with a clarity that was almost painful what this discovery meant. She could live here. The thought came not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual recognition. She had no house. She had no money to build one. She had 40 acres of ridge that could not be farmed or timbered or grazed, but beneath that land, hidden behind a crack no wider than her shoulders, was a natural shelter of extraordinary quality. Dry, warm, spacious, with good air and clean water. The cathedral chamber alone was large enough to build a home inside, with room to spare. The pool provided water. The constant temperature eliminated the need for heating fuel, except for cooking. Her brothers thought they had given her nothing. They had given her everything. On the fourth day, walking back from the nearest settlement with supplies, Verity found the dog. It was lying by the side of the road, a border collie, black as coal, so thin that its ribs showed through its matted fur. At first she thought it was dead, but when she knelt beside it, the dog lifted its head and looked at her with eyes that held more exhaustion than fear. Someone had abandoned it, left it to die by the roadside like a piece of broken furniture. Verity had $11 to her name. She had a 40-foot crawl between herself and shelter. She had no business taking on responsibility for another living creature when she could barely take care of herself. She shared her last piece of cornbread with the dog. She carried it the remaining 2 miles to the ridge. She pushed it ahead of her through the crack, inch by careful inch, and set it down on the floor of the cathedral chamber, wrapped in her only spare blanket. The dog survived. Against all odds, against all logic, it survived. She named it Shadow, because from that day forward it followed her everywhere like a dark extension of herself, through the crack, through the chambers, through the long, slow process of building a life from stone. The first winter was a trial of logistics rather than survival. The crack was the problem. Everything Verity needed, food, fuel for her lantern, tools, materials for building, had to pass through 18 inches of limestone. She could not bring in lumber. She could not bring in a stove. She could not bring in anything wider than her own narrow shoulders. She solved it incrementally. First, she widened the crack. Not dramatically. She had no blasting powder and no desire to damage the cave's natural structure, but carefully, with a hammer and chisel, removing 6 inches of protruding rock at the narrowest point. This brought the passage from 14 inches to 20 at its tightest, which made the difference between a squeeze that left her breathless and a passage that was merely uncomfortable. The work took 2 weeks. Her hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again. Her shoulders ached from swinging the hammer in a space too narrow to swing properly. Each chisel stroke sent a sharp crack echoing through the passage and into the cathedral beyond. And each echo reminded her that she was altering something ancient, something that had existed in its precise dimensions for millennia. She removed only what was necessary, no more. Second, she established a supply system. She carried in food, lamp oil, and small tools through the widened crack, caching them in the cathedral chamber in natural alcoves that served as pantry, workshop, and storage. Larger items she pushed ahead of her through the passage, sometimes spending an hour moving a single object 40 feet. Third, she began to build inside the cave. Not a house. The cave was her house, but the furnishings and infrastructure that transformed bare stone into a habitable space. She built a sleeping platform from cedar planks, raised a foot off the floor to keep her bedding dry. She built a desk from scavenged wood, wedging it into the alcove near the flowstone curtain where the light from her lantern reflected most usefully off the translucent stone. She built shelves for her books and her growing collection of mineral specimens. Each piece of furniture was built inside the cave from components small enough to pass through the crack, assembled with mortise and tenon joints and wooden pegs. No nails because nails required a forge, and a forge required ventilation that the cave's narrow entrance could not provide. The cooking problem she solved with characteristic ingenuity. She built a small fire pit near the entrance passage, at the point where the crack began to widen into the cathedral. The natural draft through the crack, that constant exhalation of cave air, carried the smoke outward and upward, creating a natural chimney that required no construction. The fire was small, fueled by cedar kindling and hardwood sticks that she brought in daily, and it provided enough heat to cook simple meals. Beans, cornmeal, whatever small game she could trap on the ridge above. Shadow watched all of this with the patient attention of an animal that has learned to trust. He lay near the fire while she cooked, followed her through the chambers while she explored, and pressed against her side at night while she slept on her cedar platform with the darkness absolute around them. The darkness was something she had to learn to live with. Not the ordinary darkness of a closed room or a cloudy night, but the darkness of the deep earth, a blackness so total that her eyes could find no difference between open and shut. It was the same darkness that had existed in this chamber since the rock formed, since the water carved it, since the first stalactite began its infinitely slow descent from ceiling to floor. At first it frightened her. She kept a candle burning through the night, a small flame against the immensity of the dark. But gradually, over weeks and months, she learned to let the darkness be what it was. Not an absence of light, but a presence of something older, something patient, something that did not require her fear and did not respond to it. She learned to lie in it and listen to the silence, which was not quite silence. There was the faint drip from the pool chamber, the barely perceptible movement of air through the passages, and beneath everything, a deep subsonic hum that she could feel more than hear, the vibration of the earth itself, patient and enormous. She learned to sleep soundly. The stone held her like a hand. Word reached the settlement, as word always did. A trapper named Ezra Cole, following a deer trail along Sorrow Ridge in January, noticed smoke rising from a crack in the rock. He investigated and found, to his considerable alarm, a woman's coat in a coil of rope lying at the entrance to what appeared to be a fissure in the earth. He called out. After a moment, a voice answered from inside the rock. "Who is there?" the voice said. "Ezra Cole." "Who the hell are you?" "Verity Thornton. I live here." Ezra did not go in. He went to town and told everyone he met that old Jeremiah Thornton's youngest girl had gone mad and was living inside Sorrow Ridge like a snake in a crevice. The story spread rapidly, acquiring embellishments with each retelling. By the time it reached Verity's brothers, the version they heard was that she had been driven insane by grief over their father's death and was sleeping in a hole in the ground, eating raw meat and talking to herself. Marcus rode out to the ridge on a cold February morning, not from concern, but from a sense of proprietary embarrassment. A Thornton living in a crack in the rock reflected poorly on the family, and Marcus, as the eldest, felt obligated to address it. He found Verity at the entrance to the crack, splitting kindling. Shadow sat beside her, watching the approaching horse with calm alertness. "You need to come down from here," Marcus said. He did not dismount. "Why?" "Because you are living in a hole. I am living in a cave. There is a difference. People are talking. People always talk. It does not require my participation." Marcus's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to resistance from Verity, who had spent her entire life being compliant and invisible. "Father did not leave you this land so you could crawl into it like a groundhog. Father did not leave me this land at all. He left me a piece of paper that says I own the rock. What I do with the rock is my concern." Marcus stared at her for a long moment. His horse stamped impatiently, eager to be gone from this barren place. "You have changed," he said finally. "I have found something worth changing for." Marcus left. He did not ask what she had found, because it did not occur to him that a crack in a limestone ridge could contain anything worth finding. This failure of imagination was not unique to Marcus. It was shared by the Reverend Josiah Blackwood, who rode up to the ridge 2 weeks later to save Verity's soul. Blackwood was 52 years old, lean and stern, with the unshakable certainty of a man who believed he spoke for God. He had baptized Verity as an infant and had watched her grow up in his congregation with the same quiet detachment he showed all the women and children of his flock. They were souls to be shepherded, not individuals to be known. He dismounted at the crack and called into it. "Miss Thornton, I have come to speak with you about your salvation." Verity emerged a few moments later, blinking in the winter sunlight, shadow at her heels. Her dress was dusty with limestone powder. Her hands were rough and calloused. She looked, Blackwood thought, like a wild thing, like something that had forgotten how to be civilized. "Reverend," she said, "this is a surprise. I have heard disturbing reports that you are living in a hole in the ground, like an animal. It is a cave. The distinction matters. The distinction does not matter to God. God did not create human beings to live in the earth. That is where we put the dead." Verity considered this. "With respect, Reverend, God also created caves. Perhaps he had a reason." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He did not like being contradicted, especially by a young woman, who should have been grateful for his concern. "I fear for your soul, Miss Thornton. I fear that grief has driven you to madness, and that madness has driven you away from the light, both literal and spiritual." "My soul is well, Reverend, but I thank you for your concern." She did not invite him into the cave. She did not offer him water or food. She simply stood at the entrance to her home with her dog beside her and waited for him to leave. He left, but not before delivering a final warning. "The darkness takes things from us, Miss Thornton. Things we do not know we have lost until it is too late. I pray you find your way back to the light before the darkness claims you entirely." Verity watched him ride away down the ridge. Then she turned and crawled back through the crack into the cathedral chamber, where the temperature was 56 degrees and the formations glowed amber in the lamplight, and the darkness was not an enemy, but a friend. The next skeptic was more dangerous than either Marcus or the Reverend. Dr. Cornelius Marsh arrived in March. At Marcus's request, Marsh was 45 years old, the only physician within 30 miles, and he carried himself with the absolute authority of a man who had studied medicine at a real university in Philadelphia and never let anyone forget it. Marcus had hired him to evaluate Verity's mental state. The goal, though Marcus did not state it explicitly, was to have her declared incompetent. If Verity could be proven mad, Marcus could petition the court for guardianship over her and her property. And if Marcus controlled Verity's property, Marcus controlled whatever worthless rocks she had decided to make her home among. Marsh spent an hour on the ridge, asking Verity questions, watching her responses, making notes in a leather-bound journal. "Do you hear voices, Miss Thornton?" "Only yours, doctor." "Do you see things that are not there?" "I see exactly what is there." "It is quite remarkable. Would you like me to show you?" Marsh declined to enter the cave. He had seen enough, he said. His diagnosis was clear. "Hysteria," he told Marcus later that day in the comfort of the farmhouse parlor, "brought on by the trauma of her father's death and exacerbated by social isolation. The prognosis is poor unless she can be removed from this environment and placed under proper care. Can you testify to that in court? Marcus asked. I can and I will. What Marcus did not know, what neither he nor Marsh suspected, was that Verity had supporters of her own. One of them was 72 years old, with white hair and skin weathered by 7 decades of Tennessee weather. His name was Ezekiel Boone, and he had been trapping these hills since before Jeremiah Thornton was born. Unlike Marcus in Blackwood and Marsh, Ezekiel actually entered the cave. He showed up at the crack one morning in early April, announced himself politely, and asked if he might see what all the fuss was about. Verity, surprised but not displeased, led him through the passage. It took Ezekiel longer to navigate the crack than it had taken Verity. He was an old man, his joints stiff and his breath short, but he made it through. And when he emerged into the cathedral chamber, he stood very still for a very long time. My grandfather, he said finally, told me about caves like this, in the old country, Scotland. He said the ancient people lived in them through the worst winters, said the earth kept them warm when the sky wanted them dead. He turned to look at Verity with eyes that had seen more of life than most people would ever know. You are not crazy, girl. You are doing exactly what people have always done when they had no other choice. You are surviving. He visited twice more that spring, bringing small gifts, a better knife, a warmer blanket, a bag of dried apples from his own store. He never stayed long, and he never said much, but his presence meant something that Verity could not quite name. Someone believed in her. Someone saw what she was doing and understood. The woman who changed everything arrived in April of 1852. Her name was Harriet Langford, and she was 58 years old, with silver hair pinned back in a practical bun and hands that had spent 3 decades handling rock samples and surveying equipment. She was a professor of natural science at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, one of only a handful of women in the country who held such a position, and she had come to the Cumberland region to study the karst topography that characterized the geology of eastern Tennessee. She had heard through the network of local contacts that any good field scientist cultivated about a young woman living inside a ridge. Most people who heard this story assumed madness. Harriet assumed a cave. She arrived at Sorrow Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon, accompanied by a student assistant and a mule loaded with surveying equipment. Verity met her at the crack. Miss Thornton, Harriet said, peering at the fissure with the eager attention of a woman who saw cracks in rock the way other people saw doors. I am told you have found something interesting. I have found several somethings, connected behind this crack. Would you like to see them? Harriet would. The passage through the crack was difficult for her. She was taller and broader than Verity, and her 58-year-old joints protested every inch of the journey. But she made it through with determination that bordered on obsession. And when she emerged into the cathedral chamber, she stood motionless for several minutes, her surveyor's eyes taking in dimensions that Verity could only estimate. Then she began to measure. She spent 4 days in the cave. She measured the cathedral chamber with proper instruments, a surveyor's chain and a clinometer, and found it to be 92 feet long, 78 feet wide, and 44 feet from floor to ceiling at its highest point. She cataloged the formations with the systematic precision of a woman who had spent 30 years classifying the Earth's wonders. She tested the water in the pool chamber and found it pure, fed by percolation through the limestone, naturally filtered, low in minerals, drinkable without treatment. She also read Verity's notebooks, all 6 of them. She sat in the cathedral chamber by lantern light, turning pages with the careful attention of a scholar who recognizes quality when she sees it. And when she finished, she looked at Verity with an expression that combined professional respect with something approaching astonishment. These are excellent, Harriet said. Your formation descriptions are as precise as any I have seen from trained surveyors. Your hydrological observations are rigorous. Where did you study? I did not study. I read my mother's books. You taught yourself geology from books. I taught myself to look. The books taught me what I was looking at. Harriet was quiet for a moment. The lantern light played across the flowstone curtain, turning it to amber. Miss Thornton, do you understand what you have here? A cave. You have one of the most significant cave systems I have encountered in 20 years of karst research. The formations in the soda straw chamber alone are worth a scientific paper. The helictites are museum-quality specimens. And this room, she gestured at the cathedral. This room is extraordinary. The scale, the preservation, the variety of formations. This is a site of genuine scientific importance. She paused. There is also the practical matter. What practical matter? Tourism. Cave tourism is becoming a significant industry. People will pay good money to see something like this. Verity looked around the chamber that had been her home for 5 months. She had not thought of it as something other people might want to see. She had thought of it as hers. I do not want to damage the formations. Nor should you. The best operations are careful ones. Guided tours, controlled access, preservation as a priority. The cave's value increases the more intact it remains. Harriet leaned forward. I can help you. I can bring this to the attention of the scientific community. I can connect you with people who understand both the science and the business. Then she added something that made Verity's blood run cold. I should also tell you, Harriet said, that I have heard rumors in town. Your brother Marcus is attempting to have you declared mentally incompetent. He has engaged the services of Dr. Cornelius Marsh and is planning to petition the court for guardianship over you and your property. Verity felt the cave walls press in around her, not physically, but emotionally. All the space she had carved out for herself, all the safety she had built, suddenly felt fragile and temporary. When, she asked. Soon. The petition is expected within the month. I have also learned that Judge Harlan Whitfield will preside over the case. He is a friend of your brother's. They have dined together 3 times in the past month. What can I do? Harriet's eyes were steady and kind. You can prove that you are not mad. You can demonstrate that what you have built here has value. Scientific value, economic value, cultural value. You can show the court that you are not a woman who has lost her mind, but a woman who has found something extraordinary. And I will help you do it. Stop here for a moment, if you would. Verity has found her cave. She has found her calling. She has found in Professor Harriet Langford something she has never had before. A mentor, a believer, a friend. But her brother Marcus is not finished. He is watching, waiting, planning, and he has powerful allies. A doctor who will testify to her madness, a judge who owes him favors. What do you think Marcus will try next? How far do you think a man like Marcus will go to take what he believes should be his? Think about it. And when you are ready, we will see how close you were to the truth. Harriet returned to Nashville 2 days later, but not before writing a preliminary report on the cave that she promised to submit to the Nashville Scientific Gazette. She also left behind a gift, a surveying compass, finely made, with a brass case that gleamed in the lamplight. For taking accurate measurements, she said, your estimates have been remarkably good, but precision matters when you are building a scientific record. Verity held the compass like it was made of gold. No one had ever given her a scientific instrument before. No one had ever treated her curiosity as something worth equipping. The article appeared in the Gazette 3 weeks later. It was titled A Remarkable Cave System in Carter County, Tennessee, and it described Thornton's Sanctuary Cave, as Harriet had named it, in terms that were unusually enthusiastic for the period's typically restrained scientific prose. The article brought letters, the letters brought visitors, and the visitors brought problems. The first problem was access. The crack was impossible for most people, and even Verity's careful widening had only made it marginally easier. She needed another way in. She had identified, during her explorations, a second potential access point, a sinkhole on the ridgetop, roughly 30 feet east of the crack, connected to the cathedral chamber through a vertical shaft. The shaft was natural, a chimney in the rock roughly 4 feet in diameter, descending 25 feet to the chamber floor. It had been blocked at the surface by a plug of soil and debris that had accumulated over centuries. But the connection was real. She dug it out by hand. The work took 6 weeks. She lowered herself on a rope and hauled the debris up in a bucket. Load after load, day after day. The work was dangerous. Loose rock fell from the shaft walls without warning, and twice she narrowly avoided being struck by stones that would have killed her. She reinforced the shaft with a timber crib, a square frame of interlocking logs stacked like a well casing that held the wall stable, and provided a structure for the ladder she would eventually install. The ladder itself was a piece of craftsmanship that surprised even her. She built it from black locust, the hardest and most rot-resistant wood available in the Tennessee hills, with round rungs mortised into the side rails and secured with oak pegs. It descended the full 25 feet of the shaft and landed on the cathedral floor near the base of the great flowstone curtain. The climb was not easy, but it was possible for any able-bodied person. The first official tour of Thornton's sanctuary cave took place on the 15th of June, 1852. 6 visitors descended the ladder and spent 2 hours in the cathedral chamber, the pool room, and the soda straw gallery. Guided by a young woman whose knowledge was deep and genuine, and whose respect for the cave was evident in every word she spoke, she charged 25 cents per person. She made $1.50. It was the first money Verity had earned in her life that did not involve selling eggs or mending other people's clothes. The second visitor who changed everything arrived in late June, shortly after the first tours began. His name was Gideon Whitmore, and he was 24 years old, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and hands that were stained with ink and graphite. He was an artist, a scientific illustrator who had been commissioned by Harriet Langford to create detailed drawings of the cave's formations for an academic publication. He descended the ladder with a portfolio under one arm and a case of drawing supplies under the other, and he spent his first hour in the cathedral chamber simply standing still. Not measuring, not cataloging, just looking. "You see it," Verity said. It was not a question. Gideon turned to her. His eyes were the color of the pool in the second chamber, dark and clear, with a depth that invited study. "I see everything," he said, "but I will need weeks to draw it." He stayed for a month. He worked in the cathedral chamber by lantern light, making sketches that he would later refine into finished illustrations. His drawings were not merely beautiful, they were precise, accurate enough that geologists could identify mineral types and formation processes from the illustrations alone. But what struck Verity most was not his technical skill. It was the way he looked at things. He looked at the formations the way she looked at them, with patience, with attention, with the conviction that the world revealed itself only to those who were willing to stay and look again. "You notice things," she said to him one evening, as they sat near the entrance, watching the sunset paint the ridge in shades of gold and amber. "Everyone notices things," Gideon said. "Everyone looks. Not everyone sees." He turned to her. The light caught his face, softening the angles. "You sound like my father. He was a naturalist. He used to say that seeing was the hardest work there was. Harder than digging, harder than building. Because when you really see something, you have to accept what is there. Not what you expected, not what you wanted. What is? What did you expect here?" Gideon smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile. "Formations. I found something else." He did not say what. He did not need to. The courtroom was packed. It was September of 1852, and Marcus Thornton had finally filed his petition to have Verity declared mentally incompetent. The case was being heard in the Carter County Courthouse, and every seat was filled with people who wanted to see how the story would end. Judge Harlan Whitfield presided over the proceedings with the careful neutrality of a man who had already made up his mind. He was 55 years old, wealthy from land speculation, and he had dined at Marcus Thornton's table 3 times in the past month. The townspeople who packed the courtroom knew this. Verity knew this. But knowing and proving were different things. Whitfield called the court to order with a rap of his gavel that echoed like a gunshot. Marcus presented his case first. He called Dr. Cornelius Marsh, who testified that Verity suffered from hysteria brought on by grief and exacerbated by isolation. He called the Reverend Josiah Blackwood, who testified that Verity had rejected his spiritual guidance and was living in a manner contrary to God's design for women. He called 3 neighbors who testified that they had heard Verity talking to herself, that she kept strange hours, that she had refused all offers of proper employment. The evidence, Marcus argued, was clear. His sister had lost her mind, and it was his duty as her eldest brother to protect her from herself. Then it was Verity's turn. Her first witness was Professor Harriet Langford, who had traveled from Nashville specifically to testify. Harriet described the cave in scientific terms, explained its significance, and presented Verity's notebooks as evidence of a methodical and rigorous mind. "These are not the records of a madwoman," Harriet concluded. These are the records of a naturalist, a careful observer, a scientist. Her second witness was Gideon Whitmore, who presented his illustrations and explained the process by which they had been created. I have worked with scholars and academics across the South, Gideon said. I have rarely encountered anyone who understands the natural world as clearly as Miss Thornton does. Her third witness was old Ezekiel Boone, who shuffled to the front of the courtroom and fixed the judge with a stare that had intimidated bears. That girl is not crazy, Ezekiel said. She is doing what people have always done when they had no other choice. She is surviving, and she is doing it better than most men I know. The courtroom murmured. Judge Whitfield called for order, and then something unexpected happened. Phineas Thornton stood up. He had been sitting in the back of the courtroom, silent as always, his face unreadable. But now he walked to the front and asked the judge's permission to speak. Your Honor, Phineas said, his voice quiet but steady, I am Verity's brother. I have not seen her cave. I have not read her notebooks. I cannot speak to the science of what she has found. He paused. But I can speak to my brother's motives. The courtroom went absolutely still. Marcus does not care about Verity's mental health, Phineas continued. He cares about her land. He believes, now that the cave has attracted attention, that the property may have value. He wants to control it. He wants to sell it. And he is using this court to steal from his own sister what our father intended her to have. Phineas turned to look at Marcus, whose face had gone red with fury. I will not be party to it, Phineas said, and I am prepared to testify to the conversations Marcus and I have had about this matter, conversations in which his intentions were made very clear. Judge Whitfield's face had gone pale. The implications of Phineas's testimony were clear. If Marcus had conspired with a sitting judge to steal his sister's property, both men faced ruin. Whitfield called a recess. When the court reconvened 2 hours later, he announced that he was recusing himself from the case due to a conflict of interest. A judge from the next county would be brought in to review the petition. Marcus withdrew his petition before the new judge could be seated. Whitfield never presided over another case in Carter County. He resigned from the bench 3 months later and moved to Knoxville, where no one knew his name or his shame. Verity had won. But she knew, watching Marcus's face as he left the courtroom, that the fight was not over. It had only changed form. She had won the battle. But Marcus's face, as he left the courtroom, told her everything she needed to know. The war was not over. Pause here and consider. What weapons does a man like Marcus have left when the law has failed him? What can he do when he cannot take by force? He can whisper. He can lie. He can poison the well of public opinion until no one will drink from it. And that is exactly what he did. The first rumor began 3 weeks after the trial. Someone, no one knew who, started telling people that Thornton's sanctuary cave was dangerous, that there were pockets of bad air in the deep chambers, that a visitor had fainted during a tour and nearly died. None of it was true, but the truth had never stopped a good rumor. The campaign was methodical. Every week brought a new story, each more alarming than the last. First it was the bad air. Then it was stories of visitors who had emerged from the cave dizzy and disoriented, unable to remember what they had seen. Then it was whispers that Verity herself had been affected, that her mind was deteriorating, that the cave was slowly poisoning her. A woman from Elizabethton claimed her husband had visited the cave and come home changed. He could not sleep, she said. He had nightmares about being buried alive. She demanded that the county shut the operation down. The woman's husband, when asked, said he had never visited the cave and had no idea what his wife was talking about. But by then the damage was done. The story was more interesting than the truth, and stories traveled faster. Verity watched her income disappear. $5 a week became $3. $3 became $1. $1 became nothing. She had savings. Enough for a few months, perhaps. But beyond that, she would have to find other work. And finding other work would mean leaving the cave, at least some of the time. And leaving the cave would mean leaving it unguarded. She knew what Marcus wanted. He wanted her to fail. He wanted her to give up. He wanted her to come crawling back to him, begging for help, willing to sign over her property in exchange for a roof over her head and food on her table. She would die first. Shadow seemed to sense her distress. He pressed closer to her at night, his warm weight a comfort against the cold that had nothing to do with temperature. He growled softly when strangers approached the ridge, as if he too understood that enemies were circling. The lowest point came in October, when someone set fire to the wooden shelter Verity had built over the shaft entrance. She woke to the smell of smoke and emerged from the cave to find the structure engulfed in flames, the ladder inside it already catching. She saved the ladder. Barely. Her hands were blistered for weeks afterward, and the hair on the left side of her head was singed short. She never found out who set the fire. She did not need to. She knew. Harriet Langford returned to Sorrow Ridge in November, bringing equipment from Vanderbilt, air testing apparatus, a canary in a cage, the traditional miner's tool for detecting dangerous gases, a determination to prove, once and for all, that the cave was safe. She spent 3 days testing the air at every point in the cave system. The results were unambiguous. The air quality in this cave is better than the air quality in downtown Nashville, Harriet announced. There is no methane. There is no carbon dioxide buildup. There is nothing here that poses any danger to human health. She wrote a report. She published it in the Gazette. She sent copies to every newspaper in Tennessee. Slowly, the visitors returned. And Hattie Coggins, the woman who had spread more gossip than anyone else in Carter County, showed up at the ridge one morning with a basket of fresh bread and an expression of genuine shame. "Miss Thornton," Hattie said, "I owe you an apology. I repeated things I should not have repeated. I believed things I should not have believed. And I am sorry." Verity accepted the bread and the apology. She even gave Hattie a free tour of the cave. Some people, she was learning, could change. Others could not. Marcus and Silas did not stop. They simply grew more subtle. A word here, a suggestion there. Whispers that Verity was immoral, living alone with a male artist who visited too often. Whispers that she was strange, unnatural, unfeminine. Whispers that she was not the kind of person respectable folks should associate with. But for every whisper, there was now a counter voice. Harriet Langford, Gideon Whitmore, old Ezekiel Boone, Phineas, quietly in the background. And gradually, a growing number of visitors who had seen the cave and recognized its wonder. The balance was shifting. And then, in September of 1853, Verity and Gideon were married. The ceremony took place in the cathedral chamber, by lantern light, surrounded by formations that had been growing since before human beings learned to speak. Professor Harriet Langford stood as witness. Phineas attended, the only one of Verity's brothers who was welcome. Old Ezekiel Boone brought a flask of whiskey that he claimed was older than he was. Shadow, now 3 years old and fully grown, sat beside Verity throughout the ceremony, his black fur gleaming in the lamplight. The Reverend Blackwood was not invited, but a minister from Elizabethton performed the service. He seemed slightly nervous about conducting a wedding inside the earth, but he did it anyway. And when he pronounced them husband and wife, his voice echoed through the chamber in a way that made the words feel larger than themselves. Permanent, ancient, true. They made their home in the cave. Gideon continued his illustrations, building a body of work that would eventually fill 12 portfolios. Verity continued her observations, filling notebook after notebook with measurements and descriptions and the patient accumulation of knowledge. Their son was born in November of 1854, 3 years to the month after Verity had first crawled through the crack. They named him Josiah, after no one in particular, simply because they liked the sound of it. Their daughter was born in 1856. They named her Cressida, because Verity had always loved the name, and because Gideon said it sounded like something that belonged in a cave. Both children took their first breaths in cave air, 56 degrees and clean. Both children learned to walk on limestone floors worn smooth by water and time. Both children grew up believing that living inside the earth was perfectly normal, because for them, it was. The war came in 1862, the way wars always come to places that want no part of them. Soldiers from both sides passed through the valley below Sorrow Ridge, foraging for food, commandeering horses, leaving fear in their wake. Verity moved the family's stores underground, into chambers deep enough that no patrol would find them. The cave, which had always been a home, became a refuge. On the worst nights, when the sound of gunfire echoed from the gaps in the mountains, she and Gideon sat in the cathedral chamber with their children between them and listened to the silence that the earth provided. The war passed. The cave remained. And Verity added another observation to her notebooks. The earth does not care about the quarrels of men. It keeps its own time. It maintains its own peace. Let me ask you something before we continue. What do you think happened to Marcus and Silas? Think about it for a moment. Two brothers who spent years trying to destroy their sister, who spread lies about her, who tried to steal her inheritance, who refused to see the value in what she had found. What do you think the world gave back to them? Take a moment to consider it, and then we will see how close you were. Marcus Thornton died on a spring morning in 1867. He was 50 years old. He had worked the bottomland for 16 years, pushing himself and the soil harder than either could sustain. The land gave back less each year, worn out by his demands, and Marcus gave more, and the exchange was never equal. His heart stopped while he was plowing. He fell forward onto the handles and did not get up. His sons inherited a farm that was already failing, debts that exceeded assets, and a reputation in the community that had soured over the years. They sold the land to pay what was owed, and within a decade nothing remained of Marcus Thornton's portion except a headstone in the churchyard and a cautionary tale that people told when they wanted to illustrate the dangers of greed. Silas Thornton died 4 years later, in 1871, at the sawmill he had inherited from their father. A log broke free from the chain that was hauling it and struck him across the chest. He lived for 6 hours, long enough to understand what was happening, not long enough to say goodbye to anyone who mattered. There was a grim irony in his death that the community recognized immediately. Silas had spent his life cutting down trees, turning living wood into lumber, profit, progress, and in the end, it was the wood that killed him. His sawmill passed to a company from Knoxville that clear-cut the North Slope in 2 years and left behind a landscape of stumps and erosion that would take a generation to recover. By 1890, nothing remained of Silas Thornton's inheritance except damaged land and fading memory. Phineas outlived both of his older brothers. He managed his south pasture quietly, married a woman from the next county, raised 3 children who all moved away to cities where there was more opportunity. He visited the cave once a year, always in autumn, always alone. In 1869, 18 years after their father's death, he descended the ladder into the cathedral chamber and stood there for a long time without speaking. Verity stood beside him, older now, her hair showing threads of gray, her hands still rough from work. "Father knew," Phineas said at last. "Knew what? That there was something here. That is why he gave it to you. Not as a joke, not as a dismissal, as a gift. He knew you were the one who would look." Verity was quiet for a long moment. 18 years she had carried the weight of believing her father had abandoned her, had thought so little of her that he had given her nothing but worthless rock. 18 years of proving herself, of building something from nothing, of transforming a crack in a ridge into a home and a livelihood and a legacy. And now this. "How do you know?" she asked. Phineas reached into his coat and pulled out a letter. It was old. The paper yellowed. The ink faded but still legible. "I found this in his desk," Phineas said. "After the trial. I should have shown you sooner. I was ashamed of what Marcus tried to do. I did not want to think about any of it." He handed her the letter. It was in their father's handwriting, addressed to Phineas, dated 2 months before Jeremiah's death. The letter was brief, as all of Jeremiah's communications had been. "Your sister will need an ally when I am gone. Your brothers will not understand what I have done for her. They will see only the surface, the rock, the barren land. They will not look beneath. Verity is the one who looks beneath. Help her if you can, and trust that I have given her the greatest gift I had to give." Verity read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and held it against her chest. Where her heart was beating in a rhythm she had known her entire life, but was only now beginning to understand. Her father had not abandoned her. He had believed in her. He had seen all those years ago the daughter who looked at things differently, who asked questions, who was not satisfied with surfaces, and he had left her the one inheritance that would reward looking, that would require looking, that would make looking not just valuable but necessary. The tears came then, the way they had come in the cathedral chamber on that first day. Not tears of grief or joy, but something in between, something that contained both endings and beginnings. something that felt for the first time in 18 years like peace. "Thank you," she said to Phineas, "for showing me, for standing up in that courtroom, for being different from the others." Phineas nodded. He was not a man who knew how to accept gratitude, but he did not deflect it either. "Father was right about one thing," he said. "You were the one who would look." Then he climbed the ladder and went home. And Verity stood alone in the cathedral chamber with a letter from a dead man who had loved her more than she had ever known. The years accumulated like the calcite that had built the formations, slowly, steadily, each one adding a thin layer to the structure of a life. Josiah grew tall and serious, with his mother's gray eyes and his father's artist's hands. He took over the tour operations in the early 1880s, proving to be a more articulate guide than either of his parents. With a showman's instinct for drama that Verity found both impressive and slightly exhausting. Cressida grew adventurous and bold, drawn to the cave's unexplored margins, the tight passages her mother had never fully mapped, the dark corners where the lantern light did not quite reach. She was the one who discovered the seventh chamber, at the age of 12, by crawling through a passage everyone else had dismissed as a dead end. Gideon continued to draw, his illustrations growing more refined with each passing year. By 1880, he had completed what he called the Sanctuary Portfolio, a comprehensive visual record of every significant formation in the cave system. Copies were purchased by universities and museums across the country. The originals remained in the cave, in a specially built cabinet that kept them safe from moisture and time. Shadow lived until 1864, 13 years of following Verity through the chambers, of lying by the fire while she cooked, of pressing against her side while she slept. He died on a spring morning, peacefully, in the cathedral chamber where he had spent most of his life. They buried him on the ridgetop, in a spot where the morning sun fell first and where the maidenhair ferns grew in such profusion that the rocky ground looked almost soft. Verity carved his name into a slab of the ridge's own limestone and set it at the head of the grave. Shadow, faithful companion. 1851 to 1864. He followed where I led and led where I could not follow. The cave continued to draw visitors. Though never in numbers that would have satisfied a businessman, Verity preferred it that way. She limited tours, protected formations, prioritized preservation over profit. The cave's value, she believed, increased the more intact it remained, and she continued to write in her notebooks. Observation after observation, year after year, the patient accumulation of a lifetime spent looking at things carefully. The temperature never varied more than 3 degrees, winter or summer. The formations grew imperceptibly, adding perhaps an inch per century to the longest stalactites. The drip in the pool chamber maintained its ancient rhythm, falling once every 43 seconds on average, though individual intervals varied. Verity recorded all of it, the constant and the variable, the pattern and the exception, the evidence of a world that operated on timescales so vast that human life was barely a blink, barely a breath, barely a single drop falling into a pool that had been forming since before anyone had words for time. She found comfort in this, in being small, in being temporary, in knowing that the cave would continue long after she was gone, that the formations would keep growing, that the darkness would remain patient and eternal. It made her own mortality feel less like an ending and more like a transition, a passage from one chamber to another, a crack in the rock that led somewhere new. Gideon died in March of 1888, in the cathedral chamber where they had been married 35 years before. He had been ill for several months, his lungs weakened by decades of inhaling limestone dust and lamp smoke. But he had insisted on continuing to work, continuing to draw, continuing to record the beauty that surrounded them. His last illustration was of the flowstone curtain, rendered in watercolors that captured the way the lamplight penetrated the translucent stone. It remained unfinished on his desk when he died, a single formation that would never be complete. Verity sat beside him as the lantern burned low, holding his hand, watching the light play across the features that had become as familiar to her as her own. The formations above them, the stalactites and columns and the great flowstone curtain, had witnessed their arrival as young people, and would witness their departure with the same ancient patience with which they witnessed everything. The drip in the pool chamber kept its rhythm. Somewhere in the deeper passages, air moved through stone with a sound like slow breathing. I found everything I was looking for, Gideon said, near the end. His voice was barely a whisper. And then I found you. Those were his last words. Verity buried him on the ridgetop, next to Shadow, in a spot where the evening light lingered longest. She carved his name and dates into the limestone, and beneath them she added the words he had spoken on their second evening together, when they were still strangers learning to see the same things. Reality exceeded expectations. She lived for one more year. She spent it in the cave mostly, sitting in the cathedral chamber with a lantern and her notebook, writing her final observations. She wrote about the cave's constancy, the same temperature, the same formations, the same slow drip that had been falling for at least 50,000 years and would fall for 50,000 more. She wrote about what it meant to live inside the earth, to be sheltered by stone, to measure your life against a time scale that made your life invisible. She wrote about the crack in the rock that had been too narrow for her brothers, too dark for her neighbors, too strange for most people to even consider entering. And she wrote about what she had found on the other side. Not just a cave, not just formations, not just a home or a livelihood or a legacy. She had found herself, the girl who looked beneath, the woman who was not afraid of darkness, the person her father had always known she could become. Verity Thornton died on the 6th of January, 1889, in the cathedral chamber, with a lantern burning and her notebook open and the cave breathing around her in its slow, eternal rhythm. Josiah found her in the morning. He recorded the temperature in the margin of her final notebook, the way she would have wanted, 56 degrees, the same as always. Then he closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf with the others. 39 notebooks in all, spanning 40 years of observation. He climbed the ladder into the January cold and stood on the ridgetop and looked at the mountains, which were white with snow and very still. And he wept, for the mother he had lost and for the legacy she had left him, and for the cave below that would continue, as it had always continued, long after every Thornton was forgotten. Thornton's sanctuary cave remained in the family for 3 generations. Josiah operated it until 1912, expanding the tour route to include the chamber that Cressida had discovered as a girl, which he named the Cressida Gallery in her honor. His son, Jeremiah III, operated it until 1938, adding electric lighting in 1929, a modernization that his grandmother would have found both practical and faintly regrettable. The notebooks were donated to Vanderbilt University in 1940, where they became a foundational resource for the study of Tennessee karst geology. Scholars who examined them marveled at their precision, their consistency, their evident affection for the subject matter. Gideon's illustrations were acquired by a natural history museum in 1955. A selection of them remains on permanent display, accompanied by a placard that identifies him as one of the finest scientific illustrators of his era. The cave received official recognition as a protected natural area in 1972. The flowstone curtain is still intact. The soda straws still hang in their crystalline forest. The pool still holds its clear, still water, fed by a drip that has not stopped since before humans walked the continent. The fissure in the east face of Sorrow Ridge remains, narrower now than when Verity widened it, the stone having slowly reclaimed what was taken, but the crack still breathes. On cold days you can see the exhalation, a faint plume of warm air rising from the stone like the breath of something sleeping. Like the earth itself, exhaling secrets. Most people walk past it. It is too narrow, too dark, too much like a mouth. It looks like nothing. It looks like a crack in a rock on a ridge that nobody cares about. But the cathedral is still there, on the other side, 40 feet in and a world away, waiting as it has always waited, for someone willing to turn sideways and see what the darkness holds. The earth keeps its wonders in tight places. It always has. The question was never what lay beyond the crack. The question was who would be brave enough to find out. One last thought before we part. Verity Thornton was given nothing. 40 acres of worthless rock on a ridge that nobody wanted. Her brothers laughed at her inheritance. Her neighbors thought she was mad. The world told her, in 1,000 small ways, that she did not matter, that her curiosity was strange, that her way of looking at things was wrong. She proved them all mistaken, not by arguing, not by fighting, not by demanding recognition. She proved them by looking, by going where others would not go, by being brave enough to crawl through the narrow places and patient enough to see what was on the other side. And she left behind something that mattered. Notebooks full of observations, illustrations that captured beauty, a cave that people still visit, still marvel at, still learn from, a legacy. I wonder sometimes what tight places exist in our own lives, what cracks in the rock we walk past every day because they look like nothing, because they are too narrow, too dark, too much like mouths that might swallow us. I wonder what cathedrals might be waiting, 40 feet in and a world away, if we were brave enough to look. Fear is a door. Walk through it. The end.